Hello everyone and welcome. In this video we're going to be talking about why lugging your engine is a bad idea. And by lugging your engine, what I mean is putting your engine at a very high load, for example flooring it when it's at a low engine RPM, such as about 1500 RPM. So let's say you're in 5th gear, 6th gear, something like that, you're only cruising at about 40 miles an hour and you floor it, this is going to lug your engine. And so the reason, first of all, I want to get into some logic that I actually heard from Car Talk, and I thought it made quite a bit of sense. And then I'm going to get into a study done by Toyota and Denso talking about low-speed pre-ignition, which is more prevalent for small turbocharged engines using higher boost. And so first off, putting it in a high gear and trying to accelerate is kind of counterintuitive because you're going to have less wheel torque as a result of the gearing disadvantage. So obviously it makes sense to downshift if you're trying to accelerate. You're putting your engine at a disadvantage because you're telling it to do more work than it can. And so by putting it on these higher gears, your engine has to work harder, meaning it's going to be less efficient. And so if it's operating in a less efficient range, it's going to heat up more. Because efficiency, of course, correlates with heat. So you have more heat going into the engine block itself rather than just into useful work. So as you overwork that engine, it overheats. Your temperatures inside your cylinders heats up. And then once you have higher temperatures inside your cylinders, you start to get unpredictable timing. So you can get ping, you can get knock, if you have hot spots somewhere in there, which can mess up your timing. And so this can cause uneven combustion, not only the timing, but also the location. If a deposit somewhere in there causes combustion to occur. And so if you have that uneven combustion that's occurring in different locations or at bad times, that can of course damage your piston. You can have piston slap. Let's say you have a pressure not where it's supposed to originate. Well, that can force the piston up against the cylinder wall, and so you can start to scrape up your cylinder walls. And so over time, that seal will kind of wear out and you'll burn all kinds of oil and you won't have as good of pressure. So that's kind of the, how will this cause damage in pretty much any engine? And this kind of gets into more of small turbocharged engines, low-speed pre-ignition. And so what is low-speed pre-ignition? Well, this is when you have ignition occur before your spark at a low speed, a low engine speed, so a low engine RPM, with a high load. So for example, you're flooring it. And it's caused by an ignition source, and it occurs before the spark. So this means you can't use ignition timing to get rid of it. And so what this can do is it can damage and crack your pistons, can damage your spark plugs, things like that. So it can cause pretty detrimental impacts on your engine. So what are the sources for this low-speed pre-ignition? Well, it's come down to that the ignition source has to be combustible and large enough in order to cause it. Some of the possible sources are oil droplets, which could be introduced into your combustion chamber through the positive crankcase ventilation system, deposit peelings from the cylinder walls and on top of the piston top. As well as oil dilution, which can occur from blow-by when you get gasoline mixing in with the oil and then having that oil mist spray back up into the combustion chamber from the piston sides as they're coming up and getting some oil droplets in there, and those can heat up and cause this pre-ignition. So I looked at this study, which was done by Toyota and Denso, and they kind of came up with, the process of how this occurs inside the engine. So we're going to go over that. And as I mentioned, the ignition source, what they found out, it has to be combustible and it has to be large enough in order to cause this. So here we have a piston. We're kind of looking at a zoomed in view of this is the cylinder wall and this is our piston, which would be moving up and down. And so we've got deposits that have started to form on the cylinder wall and on the piston from wall wetting, spraying in gasoline. And so you've got these deposits that form from oil mixtures and things like that, the contaminants that are introduced, and they form on the piston tops. Now they can form fairly quickly on the cylinder walls up at the top of the bore, as well as that crevice where the piston meets with the cylinder, and then they kind of form fairly slowly on top of the piston itself under low engine RPM, high load operations, or low load operations rather. So at low load operations, you can have these deposits start to form up on the piston. Well, eventually these deposits can peel off and float inside the combustion chamber. And so let's say we have our compression stroke here and it peels off. So we've got this combustible item, this combustible deposit which is floating in the chamber. We then have our power stroke, so it ignites this and you have a surface flame that's on this deposit. And then of course during your exhaust stroke, the deposit, it doesn't make it out the exhaust, so it remains in the chamber. Let's just say for this example, of course it could go out the exhaust and then you wouldn't have this problem, but we're assuming that it remains within the cylinder, which isn't all that unlikely. And so the surface flame is extinguished now, but it's still kind of glowing because there's some remaining oxygen in that mixture, not all of it burnt completely, and so that oxygen is reacting with the deposit and keeping it glowing. Then you have your intake stroke, and of course you're bringing in all kinds of new oxygen, so it really starts to glow once it's got all that oxygen around it. You have your compression stroke, and you've introduced that air and fuel mixture, and then as a result, this glowing deposit now ignites that air and fuel mixture before your spark fires, and you have this low-speed pre-ignition. So what this looks like as far as pressure is concerned is here we've got our cylinder pressure on the left, and here we've got our crank angle, 0 in the center, that would be top dead center. And so a normal combustion, you'll have your pressure kind of spike up. As you reach top dead center, your spark fires, and then you have that peak of pressure as that cylinder is moving down and as that combustion occurs and expands out that air and fuel mixture, which is now burning. With low-speed pre-ignition, however, this of course occurs before the spark, and so you have this peak in pressure, and it's kind of this erratic pressure that occurs much higher than normal, and so that can seriously damage your engine. So that's kind of what it looks like from a pressure standpoint versus, where your crank angle is at. And so one of the last things I want to get into here is how do you prevent this from happening? And the easiest scenario is to just not floor it when you're at low engine RPMs. So if you're at, 6th gear at 40 miles an hour, downshift into 4th maybe, or 3rd if you need to accelerate, 5th if you don't need to accelerate that hard, things like that. But point is, you can downshift, and it's very easy to prevent this. So they actually plotted in this Toyota and Denso study that they did. They plotted, they were introducing deposits into a chamber and seeing when pre-ignition would occur. And so what they plotted was the cylinder pressure versus the RPM, the engine RPM, and where you would have pre-ignition. And so it's not that pre-ignition can't occur at higher engine RPMs, it's just that it's far less likely. And that's what this graph that they figured out shows, because as you get into the lower engine RPMs, it's a much lower pressure at which pre-ignition will occur. So anything above this line, pre-ignition would occur. Anything below this line with that contaminant, of course, this has to be there. If that's there, pre-ignition still wouldn't occur, even if there was that deposit floating around in there. So at these lower pressures, or higher pressures at a higher engine RPM, you can get away with having those deposits in there and not having pre-ignition and damaging your engine. So another way of getting around it is to tune for a rich air-fuel mixture. So if you were to have, this kind of scenario right here, but you used a richer air-fuel mixture, what that does is during this exhaust stroke here, you're not going to have as much air remaining, oxygen remaining that wasn't burned in that air-fuel mixture, and so that oxygen won't be able to react with this. So this will pretty much just go out completely, and then when you have the intake air come in, it won't be enough to restart that reaction, and so you won't have all of this occur. So you can use a rich air-fuel mixture. That, however, could cause oil dilution, and it can cause deposits to form. So it's not really the greatest solution. It's just kind of something that could fix it for a very specific scenario. And then also, I think an oil catch can would be a great way to help prevent this. For example, you're not going to be introducing, so you won't have oil droplets. As I mentioned, that was one of the things that they thought, could be a source of it, is oil droplets introduced from your PCV valve, and so oil catch can, of course, just prevents that from occurring or helps to reduce it significantly, and it can also help to reduce deposits from forming on your pistons. And so that's another way of getting around it. So I hope you guys have learned something from this. Just know that you shouldn't be flooring it if you're in high gear, and here's kind of the logic behind all that. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching. Hello everyone, and welcome. In this video we're going to be talking about 5 things which you should never do in your turbocharged car. And as you can tell, we are in my 2014 Subaru STI, which has a 2.5 liter turbocharged engine. Now the first thing I want to talk about is not running your car hard until you've let everything get up to operating temperature.